and welcome to Girls Lunch, your mealtime companion where we talk about food, gender, sexuality, and where everyone is welcome.
I'm Julia Andreas.
I'm Nicole Hilton.
And Nicole, just straight off the top of your head, name your favorite restaurant.
My favorite restaurant?
Of all time. It could be like childhood, it could be now.
Does this ever happen to you? I don't know if this is just like a neurodivergent thing where someone is like, hey, name this thing. And then you've never heard of that thing in your life. Where someone's like, you could even just tell me like, name a restaurant. And I'd be like, I've never heard of a restaurant. Yeah. I don't know what that is.
No, that happens to me too.
Definitely a favorite restaurant I had in college was this place that you may remember, Julia, called Salsa's. Little Mexican restaurant.
Salsa's was where it was at, yes.
I think about their fresh chips and salsa often. I miss that place.
I think if I was to name like my favorite restaurant of all time, it would have been the Chinese food restaurant in Silver Spring that I grew up on called Good Fortune.
Oh, yeah.
Good Fortune was a remnant of when Chinese restaurants were like high-end establishments. In the sense of like, this was a huge place. It had like ballrooms. It had multiple dining rooms. And its food was consistently spectacular. And I still have not found a place that serves shrimp balls, which were just like minced shrimp meat fried in like a tempura like coating.
That sounds incredible.
They were delicious. They were my favorite things. And to this day, I've not found another Chinese restaurant that has them. But yeah, I have so many fond memories of going to Good Fortune with my family for takeout or just to eat in sometimes. And they also had like dim sum on Sundays, a la carte style.
I'm pretty sure that you took me there once before, or we had food from there at some point when I was over at your parents' house.
Oh, yeah, probably. That was like every weekend we would get food from Good Fortune. Usually only takeout, because if there was like a wedding there, and there were a lot of weddings there, then like the dine-in part was just closed. I mean, I have a lot of favorite restaurants, over the course of my lifetime. Out here in Montana, I love the place called Whistle Pig, which is a Korean restaurant. Also delicious. But when we think about a restaurant, this sort of place where we sit down and there are dining tables and we have a menu with choices and we can eat kind of at any time that it's open there is more of a modern sort of idea. And so today we're talking about restaurants and how they kind of came to be. And to start, I really want to make sure we're defining like what a restaurant is, because there have been food vendors and taverns and street vendors and inns for like, so much time since people have formed civilizations, but that's not really what we're talking about.
Define those terms. Let's define some terms.
Yeah, let's define some terms. And I'm going to be mentioning a few of these terms as I go through the history of restaurants, so it's good to kind of define those now so we're not just like, what the hell is a cookshop? Which was me when I was reading these books.
And people at home, there will be a vocabulary quiz at the end, so be sure that you're paying attention.
And it will be graded. We will need you to hand in your essays at the end of class.
If you don't get at least a C, you unfortunately can no longer listen to the podcast. Make sure you go to the registrar for a drop slip.
Oh my god. So to go through some definitions, cookshops were early street vendors in England, mainly London, that had a building and a kitchen, but served through a window or a door or an open space. And they served hot food and sometimes ale, but they didn't have any seating or tables. It'd be kind of like, walking out to like a takeout window today. I feel like that's more common maybe in other countries. I feel like America doesn't really have too many just like takeout windows.
Yeah, the only place I can think of, I think I've seen like hot dog or maybe burger stands.
Yeah.
Where you like just go up and order and then they just hand it to you and then tell you to get lost. I think I've also seen like ice cream stands like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a place in Italy that we went to called Mr. Chips that was kind of like that. You just walked up and ordered your french fries, but there wasn't like anywhere you could sit. You just had to go walk around with your french fries, which was fun. There's also alehouses and pubs, which had seats and ale but no food. and they didn't serve wine. And so, like, we'll also get into how, like, some places will also serve wine, but no ale. Some places serve ale, but no wine. And kind of, like, how that would indicate the status of the people going there. We had inns, and inns only served travelers and had stables for horses. They didn't have a menu. You just ate whatever they gave you whenever it was dinner time. So it would just be like, 7 o'clock, dinner time, here is a bowl of gruel. And that's just all you got.
Yep.
Taverns are similar, and they only served travelers until about the 1400s. And even then, they only served like a la carte menus. They had wine. Taverns were seen as more refined and socially superior because they had wine over ale, and they were more popular because of that, because of like the perceived status. And by the 18th century, they started serving food and even gave customers choices. So unlike inns, which were very much like you get what you get and you don't get upset, taverns were like, would you like a bowl of gruel or a bowl of other gruel?
Perhaps a porridge.
Perhaps some oatmeal. There's also the term ordinary, which I actually feel like I had heard but never really registered until I started researching this episode. But an ordinary were places that had a cheap set menu, and then later they became more like simple dining establishments that offered cheap ale and food. And ordinary was like a really popular term for a restaurant in the American colonies. And so like the word ordinary kind of fell out of style when restaurants became more popular in like Britain, but in the American colonies, the term ordinary was used quite often. It'll come up later when we talk about women in restaurants.
I was going to say, I don't know if I have heard of, or maybe I have. I feel like it's talking to something like very far back in my brain that maybe I heard like once, but maybe that's like the Puritan brain that I have.
I feel like I've read it, I read it in some sort of story where it's like, oh, me and Martha are going to go to the ordinary for a nice luncheon. And then kind of like I mentioned earlier, a modern restaurant is a dining establishment that has seats and tables, a menu with multiple choices, and is, most importantly, it's primarily about the food. Like a bar is more about drinking and socializing than it is about eating. Like you might have bar snacks, but a modern restaurant, you are there to have like a specialized meal.
Right.
Like if you're going to go to Olive Garden, you're going there because it has, quote, Italian food, end quote.
You're going there for the unlimited salad and breadsticks. That's what you're going for.
Exactly. So yeah, just kind of making sure we understand what we're talking about when we're talking about restaurants. Maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, there's been versions of this for a very long time. There's no real way to say when the first, quote, restaurant, end quote, was created, but a lot of people point to the ruins in Pompeii.
Oh, yeah. I think I've heard about this, where there's like the remnants of like almost like a fast food counter in a way. Like people would like come up and order. I guess it's sort of like a fast food or like a carry out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so like Pompeii was frozen by the volcanic ash in 79 AD, and during this time the Roman Empire was like in full swing, and archaeologists have identified about 160 properties that appear to have been bars and restaurants and hotels, and like other eating places like you mentioned, where people could just walk up to a counter and like get food and leave. And they think that this large number is probably because in a diverse and transient city like Pompeii, many people would not have had utilities in their homes to prepare food, like ovens and sinks. And so the book I was reading was kind of like equivocating, like, I don't know, that's a word.
It is.
Oh, good.
It is, in fact, a word.
This will also be on your vocab test. Was like, talking about how back then Pompeii is a lot like modern day Manhattan, where these people are all in these tiny, tiny spaces that don't necessarily have the means to make their own food. Because, like, a lot of apartments in Manhattan, maybe you don't have a full stove, or maybe you don't even have a full fridge, or maybe all you have is a microwave.
You're lucky you get a bed.
Yeah, you're lucky if you get a window. And so, kind of like Manhattanites today, people in Pompeii were probably there for a little bit, or like, it's a packed city, so that maybe they didn't have the space or the means to make food at home, so they often went out to bars and restaurants. I also want to point out Sung Dynasty China. The Sung or Song dynasty was from 960 to 1276 AD, and there are many descriptions of China's restaurant culture during this time period, when back in the Western Hemisphere during this time, you could really only get food at like monasteries if you were like, please give me food, or like taverns or inns. I have a bit of a block of texts for you to read here just about the descriptions of Southern Sung Dynasty China's casual list of 234 famous dishes.
Casual list. Okay. Hit me up with that block. Okay, here we go. A Southern Sung source, that is a tongue twister right there. A Southern Sung source gives a casual list to 234 famous dishes that such places served. A list from the Northern Sung has 51. Dinners probably started with a soup or broth like 100 flavor soup, which tops both lists. They could then choose from dishes made from almost any variety of flesh, fowl, or seafood, milk-steamed lamb, onion-strewn hare, fried clams, or crabs. Several kinds of variety meats, lungs, heart, kidneys, or caul, were cooked in various manners. Some kinds of buns and cakes were also available, though other kinds of restaurants specialized in such things. Ordering was done in approximately the same way in Kaifeng and Hangzhou, where all restaurants had menus. What is caul? C-A-U-L.
I actually have no idea.
I'm imagining it's like some kind of organ.
Yeah.
This is great. According to the Oxford Dictionary, it's the amniotic membrane enclosing a fetus.
Ew.
Yeah, the membrane that covers a newborn's head and face.
Gross.
That's extremely gross.
I'm sure it is tasty when prepared correctly. She says, trying not to ick anyone's yum, but like...
Trying to not be, like, culturally insensitive, but to me...
To me, that is a no thank you. But yeah, like you saw when you read that text, it very clearly is like these places had diverse menus for you to choose from. They had specialized meals, and you could sit down and order. So very much like how we would think of a restaurant today, and that was like 1,000 years ago, way before a lot of the Western cultures kind of got around to it. Speaking of which, in medieval England, before 1400, dining out did not exist in the way that the Romans and the Sung Dynasty Chinese knew it, and how we know it today. And this is something that I'm really super curious as to why, like, something like Pompeii's restaurant culture would die out, because it probably wasn't just in Pompeii, it was probably throughout the Roman Empire as well, in big cities. But having it disappear after, like the Roman Empire ended, and then having it have to start again from scratch, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to, like, why? Was it because of the day-to-day structure of people? Was it, like, monetary? Was it resource-based?
Yeah, that is really interesting.
But during, like, the medieval England time period is where we do see the emergence of taverns, cookshops, inns, and alehouses that I mentioned earlier. And one of the first mentions of, like, a restaurant-like establishment is from a 1410 poem called London Lickpenny, author unknown, where the main character comes across, well, he goes into, like, London to try and, like, sue someone. I don't remember exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a poem from 1410. It's a little hard to parse sometimes. But most importantly, he is leaving London, where he comes across a new and, like, fancy dining establishment that's unlike the rowdier cookshops. And the cooks here are attentive and respectful, and they offer him a table, and they spread out a tablecloth. And so apparently, like, the use of a tablecloth is, like, new and really, like, indicates, oh, this is, like, a fancy place.
Well, that is probably true, since fabric was quite expensive for quite a long period of time, of just, like, being able to just have fabric, not for, like, clothes or anything, but just to, like, put out. And also, like, having enough fabric to cover an entire table, I guess, is kind of like a show of wealth.
Especially if it's, like, white, you know?
Yeah. And being able to keep it clean.
Mm-hmm. So it definitely, like, indicates, because, like, you know, restaurants today even will pull the white tablecloth thing to show that they're fancy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But yeah, at the end of the poem, he's like, oh no, that's too fancy for me, and he runs away.
Same. Very relatable, Mr. Lickpenny, if that is your real name.
I don't know his name. Moving onward in time to, like, the French Revolution, where we really actually start to see the starts of how restaurants came to be. The new, never-before-seen middle class of the bourgeoisie and merchants and traders felt that, you know, the aristocrats, the fancy people. Hold on. My brain is doing a real hard fart.
I don't know if we mentioned people at home. People at home, Julia does, in fact, have a concussion at this moment.
I have a concussion right now. I'm doing this for you, our 4 listeners.
All 4 of you.
All 4 of you. Let me just try and say aristocracy. I can't say it. Aristocracy. Okay.
There you go.
Oh my god. I've never felt more concussed than in this moment. What was I even saying?
You're talking about the bourgeoisie and the middle class.
They felt that the aristocracy was holding back progress, which led to the French Revolution, and as I have written here, the choppy of a good number of royal heads.
It's time for the choppy to begin.
It's time for the choppy.
The choppy will not be televised.
All of the royalty, all of the aristocracy was either beheaded or left. And because of all of these deaths and abandonment of their domestic homes, it also left a lot of chefs, servants, and other workers like butlers and maids unemployed. Like, just think about it. If you're just like a chef, right, and you've cooked for like the Duke of whatever for your whole life, and you're really good at that, and you know how to manage like huge feasts, and then suddenly you're unemployed, you're like, what am I gonna do?
And then at this point, what they started doing was
DoorDash.
No, eating the rich.
Oh,
actually,
no, you're right.
Is
They're like, well, I guess I'll eat the rich via DoorDash. So what they did do is they traveled to Paris for employment, and they opened restaurants. One guy, his name is Robert, don't know his last name, was the executive chef for the Prince of Conde. I don't know how to say that. Sorry, French people.
It seems right.
And he was able to use his knowledge of suppliers and food to open up his own restaurant, which others would come work at and then go to open their own establishments. Kind of like how a lot of the writers and animators that went to work on Adventure Time back in the early 2000s went on to create their own little cartoon shows on Cartoon Network, like Over the Garden Wall, Gravity Falls, and things like that. So, you know, if you create a space where people who are skilled can come and work, they can then go take those skills and create their own new things.
Imagine if we paid creative people what they were worth.
That sounds like they'd be more choppy of heads if that was to happen. But yeah, so Paris had like a pretty high demand of restaurants, and the cuisine that was created by all these really skilled chefs was created for pleasure and not survival, which is like a big difference. Because like you think of taverns and inns and other things, it's like, well, I have to eat because I am traveling, and that is just what I need. But these were more of like, I feel like having a little treat. I'm going to go to the little pâtissier and get myself a little sandwich or whatever. And it kind of created like the class of people called like bourgeoisie gastronomes who liked to eat at these fancy little places.
The original foodies.
Yeah, the original foodies who are becoming like experts in cuisine that's stylish, and they were really good at like tasting different things. So kind of like, you know, foodies and food critics today.
Mm-hmm.
And so during this time period is where we kind of get the word restaurant. There's a story that's probably apocryphal, but you know, there's a story that goes that a man named Boulanger, I don't know how to say that.
I think it's pretty good.
Thank you. He opened an establishment in 1765 and called it a restaurant. And restaurant is actually the French word for like restorative. So like a nice soup or like a hot broth and, you know, to make you feel nice and good inside. But apparently he was stepping on the toes of the meat guild, who were legally allowed to sell meat dishes. And they said that Boulanger was not legally allowed to sell meat dishes because he wasn't in the meat guild. And they got very upsetty, and they tried to take him to court. The court was like, he's not making meat dishes, he's selling soup.
Those are different, yeah.
And some say that this is like the turning point where restaurants push out small traders and their rights to selling like exclusive goods like meats or like sausages or like pork pies or whatever. But others, like historian Rebecca Springs, say that it's like all apocryphal and like these things develop more organically and not because of just one person.
Yeah. I mean, if that were true, how did we get the hot dog cart? Your move. How's that possible?
She's just asking questions.
Just asking questions.
And then moving onward in time, we have the Industrial Revolution. And what I'm about to talk about, it's a little more like Britain specific, but it also probably applies to the US during this time period. So like the Industrial Revolution from 1760 to 1840 created systems where people had to eat away from home by necessity. And this period was a major turning point since it created jobs that meant people had to leave their villages and towns and move into cities. And since they were no longer local, they couldn't just go home for lunch or dinner.
Right. Definitely with the Industrial Revolution, I'm thinking specifically about textiles that involved a lot of young women who came from farmhouses and like lived or would work in the cities and then go home. This kind of reminds me of a lot of the discourse about that was happening during the pandemic. And I think it's still happening because a lot of people now are working remotely and cities are like people aren't going out and spending money anymore. Like all these restaurants that are near all these office buildings are going to close because no one goes to the office anymore. Not to say that like isn't a conversation that we should have. It just always, to me, is like, do you really care about these restaurants? Or is this the, like, whiny, like, wah, people need to go back to the office so that I can see that they're actually working kind of discourse?
Probably the latter. But you and I also never really went out to eat when we were working from an office.
Yeah.
It was, like, maybe Chipotle once every quarter.
Yeah.
The people who went out to eat for lunch every day just boggles my mind.
Yeah.
Like, how can you spend that money? Also, doesn't your tummy hurt?
Yeah.
How's that tum doing?
From all those Chipotle poops?
It's a lot of Chipotle, man. I don't know. But yeah, work was outside the home, and so social activities also became outside the home, like drinking and entertainment. Urban pubs became not only for drinking, but also became meeting places for things like trade unions or societies or singing saloons, ticket offices for travel, for coaches and stables, things like that. So, like, you know, once work was moved out of the home or out of the village, a lot of the social activities moved with it, which then needed spaces with food and drink because you're out there at dinner time. And so that kind of pushed the need for restaurants and the restaurant growth.
Boy, am I so interested in, I don't know, the internal, external of the home, of like what happens at home versus what happens out. That's catnip to me. Talking about that sort of things going from the domestic to, I guess, more public or public to domestic. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. Jumping over the pond into the U.S., the first restaurant in the United States opened in around 1830, and rather than like a set dinner for all diners at a single specific time, which was the practice of inns, this restaurant and restaurants that followed it offered meals during a range of hours, which is more familiar to us today, had a menu with several choices, and could cater to groups seated at tables of different sizes. So something that we haven't really talked about is how like people would be eating in different size groups.
Mm-hmm.
When we go to a restaurant today, you would have like maybe like table for 2, please, or like table for 5 or whatever. And people could be seated accordingly. Before kind of the 1800s, you just kind of sit at a table, I think, is how it went.
Whoa. That completely blows my mind, but also fully makes sense because I imagine that at that point, we haven't gotten to an era of like, CEOs and businesses must maximize profits at all times. And like, we haven't gotten to the like efficiency studies of like, how many people can I possibly fit in here and in the most efficient way? Because I know that since my brother has worked at a restaurant for about the last 12 years, I know that, you have standard size tables, right? You have 6 top, you've got a 4 top, you've got a 2 top. These are fancy industry terms, by the way. But I imagine as restaurants are just getting started, it's just sort of like, it's less like a Tetris puzzle of trying to fit as many people in there as possible for maximum profit.
Yeah. And I think, that's still very much like a US standpoint, because when I was in Slovenia for my honeymoon this past summer, like, you seat yourself. You just go get your own table. And that was wild to me, to not have to be placed somewhere, but rather just choose where I want to sit.
Yeah.
And it's just like you pull up as many chairs as you need to a table.
Whoa.
Or like you could take a table that's too big for 2 people. No one's going to say anything. And the kind of way of like you can just sit there and no one's going to rush you out.
Yeah.
It's so different. It took me forever to click that I could just go sit down because it felt so wrong as an American to do that. Restaurants were super popular for entertainment, business, and social positioning, as well as dining for men. But for women, there are many restrictions on when and where and with whom they could dine.
God forbid women do anything.
Yeah, can't do anything. And again, like this time period is going to be from like the 1930s to the 1920s, in this next section I'm talking about. So to be specific, some establishments did not serve women at all. And most high-class restaurants only admitted women if they were escorted by men. For example, a restaurant would not allow ladies in like a cafe, which would have been more casual, male-centered space like a club or a coffee house. They could dine at the restaurant at dinner, but only in the company of men. At lunch, they could dine only in all-female groups and in private rooms in places like ladies' ordinaries.
Oh, it's that word.
Were you not paying attention? Nicole, there's a quiz.
I am. I'm like, oh, there it is.
There it is.
It's like when you're watching a movie and they say the name of the movie and you go like, oh my God.
The first ladies' ordinary was opened in 1833 by the proprietors of another restaurant called the Clinton Lunch Restaurant, which they were on opposite sides of the street for each other. And I'm going to have, Nicole, you read in your old-timey voice.
Oh, boy.
I did just put this quote in here so I could get you to read in your old-timey voice an advertisement for the new dining venue that was the Ladies' Ordinary.
See, I feel like the old-timey voice that I have is like a 1920s, 1930s like newscaster reel. So this is a little bit behind the period.
Try and find your Victorian era old voice.
Well, if it's the Victorian era voice, I feel like I should like really sit up straight and stop slouching. The Ladies' Ordinary has been opened at the earnest solicitation of several gentlemen of high standing, who have long regretted that such an establishment, so necessary for the accommodation of ladies from the country, and ladies from the upper part of the city who do not wish to return home to dinner, had not long since been opened.
Beautiful. Thank you. So essentially what this ad is saying is like, do you women like to shop? Do you want to have a little treat, a little snacky snack, get a little drinky drink before you go home because it's kind of far? Well, please come to this Ladies' Ordinary where you and your gal pals can have a nice little lunch.
They can spill the tea.
I think like this seems to have like a place that only women can eat because they're not allowed to eat anywhere else. Seems like very like not great from a modern time perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to kind of think about how if I was growing up in the time period, how exciting that would be.
Yeah. I hear that and I'm like, oh, a female only space where like men aren't? Are men allowed in here? Or
I think only as servers or like chefs.
I mean, that sounds great to me. But I don't know. I mean, maybe to some degree, like I totally get what you're saying of like separate is not equal, but it could be kind of nice to be in like a feminine space like that, away from being constantly perceived by men in the 1830s was probably rough. And there are probably a lot of societal expectations in terms of like always having to be prim and proper and do all of the things. Not to say that that wouldn't exist in a feminine space like that.
And you're definitely touching on why there were feminine-only spaces during this time period, because, you know, the male cafe or restaurant or bar or pub was seen as like too loud, too rowdy, too drunk to have like proper ladies at.
Right.
Also, a lot of the modern restaurants during this time would allow men to bring a certain company along with them into some private rooms, and they did not want proper ladies to be mistaken for this, like, you know, special company, or to be in the presence of
sin
or women of ill repute, as they would say.
No, that tracks 100%.
And after the Civil War in the US, there emerged the ice cream saloon.
Ooh.
That served confectionaries, ice cream, and also midday meals. And it was definitely for the perceived taste of women at the time, who were thought to enjoy lighter, sweeter foods and treats versus like the heavy man gruel with meats and beer.
Ladies don't like bacon. Ladies like petit fours.
Exactly. And so it's like, here, for the genteel woman, her delicate constitution,
My delicate tiny little hands, for my little tiny baby hands.
have some soft serve. But these were also like less formal places that had less of a separation of women from men. So you could actually come here alone as a woman or with a group of gals, or you could come here with perhaps someone you weren't supposed to be there with.
Ooh.
So these places weren't, you know, entirely popular because they did not restrict admission. You could meet if you were like a little courting couple out on a little date, and you were defying perhaps your parents.
Ooh.
Or men could even entertain their women of ill repute. At least according to like contemporary gossip, you know, like I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's just like slander against ice cream saloons of the time. A popular novel of the day warned that ice cream served at these saloons was, quote, drugged with passion-inciting vanilla, end quote. But again, this was like midday, which was a lot more casual. But for evening meals, it was always very structured and still very separate. So in high society, part of why a woman was welcome in the evening meal is because she was being presented as arm candy, essentially, to the rest of society. This was like a time where you were going places to see and be seen. And by 1900, there were many restaurants where women could take lunch alone or in female groups, but the evening meal and the high-end restaurant remained male settings, and the presence of women was defined according to like male standards and convenience. So they were either there to make the men look good, or they were not really there at all. If restaurants were presenting as a venue for society, like that's when a woman would be there with you.
There's definitely also, even just like putting restaurants aside, I don't know how true this is now, maybe a much less extent, but for a long period of history, there's very much like a separation in Western society from like lunch etiquette and dinner etiquette. Like dinner is very formal, or like evening is very formal. Even if you want to talk about like what do you wear, you know?
Yeah, and I think if you think about a lot of historical fiction, or even, you know, stories written in this time period, there's always, you change into the evening dress for the evening meal. It is always more formal than lunch or breakfast. Moving on to Prohibition.
Woo.
That kind of destroyed the fancy restaurants because, you know, no alcohol. But it also opened up space for other eating establishments like Chinese restaurants and other ethnic restaurants. And these places did not really care who was coming in the door, if it was like a man or a woman or what class or whatever. It's like, we need people to eat our food so we can make a living as an immigrant in the United States. So we don't care if you're a woman who's not supposed to be here.
Yeah.
And women would take this chance to just go to restaurants and act independently without, you know, having to have a male escort. And it was met with resistance, especially in the high end of the dining out spectrum. By the 1920s, women were able to move with a lot more liberty within restaurants. Plain, efficient, but reasonably priced restaurants, which are the hallmarks of kind of like American dining for the past 100 years, were developed in a response to female customers in this way. So if we think about like the casual restaurant, you know, something fancier than a fast food place, but not like a 5-star dining establishment, the local burger place, or like the local just like Italian restaurant where you can just, you don't have to be in an evening gown. You can just go and get dinner. But moving back into Chinese restaurants, I could talk about like the rise of ethnic restaurants, because that's like a whole different thing, but that's a little bit out of scope for this episode.
Yeah, I think we've both listened to the episode of Proof that's about Chinese restaurants. Highly recommend. If you like this podcast, go and listen to that episode.
It's so good. I'm just going to cover it briefly here, but if you want the full story, like, please go to America's Test Kitchen. Go find their Chinese restaurants episode. It is so good. But during like the 1910s and the 1920s, Chinese people were considered both economic and moral threats to white Americans, specifically because of their restaurants, which were seen as competition to the American restaurants and were supposedly threatening the livelihoods of white owners, cooks, and servers, and motivated unions to, you know, not maybe welcome these Chinese workers into their unions to make sure everyone's getting equal pay, but no, to completely drive them out. And like this moral panic was centered a lot around these newly independent white women who were like, I'm going to go to this restaurant because I can, and you can't really stop me.
By myself.
Yeah, by myself. And there was this moral panic that like these women were going to be subject to like seduction by Chinese men, taking advantage of their female weakness and like making them addicted to opium and all of this stuff. And this hatred and vitriol towards like the Chinese restaurants actually evolved into like a law that at the American Federation of Labor's 1913 convention, organizers proposed that all states should pass laws that literally barred white women from patronizing Chinese or Japanese restaurants for these moral and economic reasons.
Cool.
And like this law was never perhaps officially enacted in all states. Police officers, like they do, began patrolling in the restaurants of their own volition because they felt like they could.
I mean, you don't have to pass a law for something to still have an effect, right?
Yes.
Like, it doesn't have to be a law on the books for, as you said, police to, like, more frequently patrol Chinese and Japanese neighborhoods, right?
Yeah.
Or restaurants, or, I don't know, like, maybe crack down on bars where, you know, gay people hang out, or drag queens, or, you know.
Exactly. Like there were newspaper reports of at the time about police who believed that they had the authority to enforce these laws that weren't even laws if they believed it was in the best interest of the white public.
I'm thinking specifically of like what led up to the Stonewall riot in the 1960s. But like police would like just hang around and they would arrest you for loitering or soliciting, you know, just like as a way of like having an excuse to arrest you and just charge you with random things.
Back in the 1910s, they would just arrest women for being at a Chinese restaurant. They would just do it anyway. They would order them out, white women out of the restaurant, or even arrest them for being there. But yeah, again, listen to America's Test Kitchen's podcast Proof in their episode about this, because it gets way more in depth than what I've just briefly touched on, and it's really incredible. Now that we've talked about sort of the rise of restaurants, Nicole, I think it's time for our food fact of the day.
I think it is too, Julia. Let's go get that food fact of the day.
Let's go.
Well, Julia, we are approaching fall. This episode's going to come out on October 1st, hopefully, which is the first day of Halloween. Happy Halloween season, everyone.
Happy spooky season.
It's here. What I have to talk to you about today is not necessarily a Halloween food, but certainly a fall food. It's actually a fall beverage, which the kids call the PSL. Do you know what the PSL is, Julia?
I am a white woman. Not women. I am multiple white women in a trench coat, and we're all drinking the pumpkin spice latte.
Yay! Walt Whitman was right. We do contain multitudes. Within you are multiple white women, and all of them are drinking the pumpkin spice latte.
I have to be honest, I've never actually had a pumpkin spice latte.
I haven't either. I hate coffee.
Yeah, I like coffee, but I drink it black.
Yeah, I have nothing against the pumpkin spice latte. I like the seasoning, the flavor of pumpkin spice is fine to me. There are or have been many pumpkin spice products that have come out in the years since the pumpkin spice latte has been released, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So this year, what I wanted to talk about today is the pumpkin spice latte is now 20 years old.
Oh my god.
Yes, isn't that crazy?
20 years?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it.
It does not feel like that.
Yeah, the pumpkin spice latte first was released in like test markets in fall 2003, specifically in Starbucks locations in our hometown major city of Washington, D.C. and Vancouver, and it did very well, obviously. The origin story of the pumpkin spice latte, very briefly, is Starbucks was trying to come up with a kind of fall drink because they had a really successful peppermint mocha that I guess they have every like Christmas winter season. Have you ever had the peppermint mocha?
I've never had the peppermint mocha, but I do love their peppermint hot chocolate. It's so good.
So hoping to reproduce that kind of success that they had with that drink, they were like, what can we make for fall? And they spitballed like a bunch of different ideas, and they were thinking originally about maybe something caramel, maybe something chocolate, just because those are much more popular flavors, and they also go pretty well with coffee. But at some point, someone comes up with pumpkin, or at least I think the way they describe it is like they were putting a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard of like things associated with fall, and someone wrote down pumpkin, and they were like, interesting. And they obviously went through a bunch of test flavors, trying to figure out like what would be the best. And they ended up coming up with not actually a pumpkin drink, because I guess this is a common misconception, or this is often kind of glossed over, but maybe people already know this, it's the pumpkin spice latte. There's not actually pumpkin in it, usually.
Yeah, it's pumpkin pie spice, but they just took out the word pie.
Right, which is usually things like cloves, nutmeg, allspice, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Those types of like fall spices. Which actually, it's funny that we mention that, because one of the original possible names for the pumpkin spice latte was Fall Harvest Latte. Not exactly a winner, so they ended up with pumpkin spice latte instead. I think the reason why you were maybe surprised, Julia, that the pumpkin spice latte is this old is it really doesn't, like, it's popular and it does really well when it first comes out, but it's not as ubiquitous or like as much of like a seasonal thing as it is associated with fall until we have Instagram, which debuts in 2010. Or like the sort of 2010s, like very fall aesthetic of like, you know, your sweater and your pumpkin spice latte and your scarf and all of the like fall leaves around you. That really like starts to populate in the 2010s with the advent of Instagram. In 2015, as we were just talking about, that there isn't actually pumpkin in the pumpkin spice latte, in 2015, Starbucks did actually start putting some pumpkin puree into the brew. I will admit, I'm not sure exactly where it is in the process, like at what point did they add the pumpkin to the drink, but supposedly there is actually pumpkin in the pumpkin spice latte now. I mean, Julia, can you think of some pumpkin spice products that you have heard of?
Absolutely. We've got pumpkin spice candles. We've got pumpkin spice soaps. We've got pumpkin spice lotions. We have pumpkin spice cereals. Like anything that could have a smell or a taste, it can be pumpkin spiced.
Including, as of 2019, I didn't know this until I read this article. I don't know how I missed it, or maybe I've just forgotten. But in 2019, Hormel, of maybe like Hormel canned chili fame, introduced limited edition pumpkin spice Spam.
That's disgusting. That's not good.
Now, Julia, we don't want to yuck anybody's
No, I will
yum.
yuck that yum. That's not good at all. Yeah, I'm not being culturally insensitive. I am a white woman, and that is disgusting.
As a white woman, I can say that we have gone too far.
That's too much.
Well, maybe now that we are sufficiently yucked, maybe we should learn more about restaurants.
Yeah, you ready to get wiggy?
Yeah, let's get wiggy.
Let's get wiggy with it. I do have to note, I just said let's get wiggy with it. So, that's concussion part 2.
You sound like Elmer Fudd.
I feel like Elmer Fudd, let's be honest. So when I was building the narrative for this episode, I thought I was really only going to focus on the entwining of US restaurant culture with women's independence. But then I found Ingredients for Revolution, A History of American Feminist Restaurants, Cafes, and Coffee Houses by Alex D. Ketchum.
Ooh.
And that was all I wanted to talk about in the second half of this episode. So this book is about feminist restaurants, self-declared feminist restaurants that came about in the 1970s. And one of these restaurants that I'll be mentioning a lot, because it's one of the restaurants that the author of this book was able to interview the owners and really get, a lot of information from, is the Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant of Bridgeport, Connecticut. It is the only remaining feminist restaurant that was founded in the 1970s.
I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but is this related at all to the idea of I remember there was a segment of the feminist movement in probably like the 60s or 70s where women were like, all of this like cooking and cleaning and domestic work that we're doing, we should actually be paid for that.
Yes.
It is? Yes.
It is,
okay.
yes.
Yay! Okay.
And we will get to that, but like you said, this was about solving what they called the cooking problem. Bloodroot is one of the hundreds of American feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses that were around from 1976 to 1985. And these spaces aimed to foster non-capitalist and non-hierarchical business practices and models that were a physical space for socializing, activism, economics, and community building for lesbians and feminists that they could support themselves. And so feminist restaurants, they produce advertisements, business cards, and flyers for events like concerts, poetry, lectures, and guest talks. And many, but not all, were women-only spaces, kind of like we were talking about with the ladies' ordinaries. Mm-hmm. Or they had women-only hours. And it's important to note that the word woman and woman space became coded for lesbian in the 1970s and 80s. And there was a lot of politics around who counted as a woman in these spaces. Yeah. And it depended on the restaurant. Some restaurants were like, yes, a trans woman is a woman. Some maybe were less open to that idea. And so lesbian feminists owned and operated the majority of feminist restaurants. I saw this Bloodroot's motto, and I thought it was hilarious, so I had to include it. The Bloodroot restaurant's motto was that feminism is the theory and lesbianism is the practice.
Hell yeah. I fucking love that.
Yeah, I thought you would.
Yes. Oh my God.
So the author, Alex, was able to kind of gather a lot of information about these restaurants at the time via the lesbian-specific travel guide called Gaia's Guide, which had multiple volumes that had information about lesbian and feminist businesses and where these people could go that was a safe space for them. And, I think oftentimes when we think about really progressive things like a feminist restaurant, we think of it starting on like the coasts, east and west coast, and spreading inwards. But that was not the case.
Oh.
Feminist restaurants were founded in larger cities all across the U.S., but then they were followed by smaller cities. And every state in the U.S., save for Alaska, Arkansas, North Dakota, West Virginia, and Wyoming, just 5 of them, had a feminist restaurant in the 1970s through 1980s, which
That's
makes
so
me
cool.
mind-boggled as to how I had never heard of them before.
I know. That's nuts.
These states didn't necessarily not have these restaurants because they were like too conservative. It was more of like they had too small or too spread out communities to be able to support a restaurant.
I imagine that's probably true in places like North Dakota and Wyoming. I actually spent a little bit of time in Arkansas, and boy, it's flat and spread out.
So the motivational drive for these owners to create these restaurants was, like I said earlier, to create a space where they could socialize, work as out lesbians, and make money that reflected their political values. Feminist restaurant owners, like I said, were primarily white, lesbian, working, and middle class, and a proportionally large percentage of them were Jewish. But there were also women of color who had feminist restaurants. There was the Black Women's Feminist Restaurant, Philadelphia Mahogany Black Women's Club, which opened in 1984. And there was a Latina working class founded feminist restaurant called San Diego's Las Hermanas Coffee House. So it was like a really diverse sort of movement. Most of them closed by the 1990s, and the high point was from 1976 to 1985.
Did you say if there are any of these that are still around?
There are a few.
Okay.
There's Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant in Bridgeport, Connecticut. There's also, I think it's called Wild Rose Cafe in Seattle.
Oh, I feel like I've heard of that.
You probably have. So there's like a handful that are still open, but not many. And so when I was reading this book, Alex, the author, talks about how they made their food feminist. Because you think of like, what is feminist food? What does that even mean?
I don't know.
Well, you're about to learn. But how they made their food feminist depended on their vegetarian ethics, how they viewed labor issues, costs, and the sourcing of products and ingredients. As much as feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses were about food, these spaces were also places where attendees could be exposed to feminist cultural productions, brain food.
Uh-huh.
And so, like you mentioned earlier, these restaurants were created to solve the cooking problem, which was the societal expectation that women had the responsibility for domestic food production, and it was viewed as a burden. And this era's solution included buying pre-made foods, sharing housework responsibilities with their male partners, requesting wages for housework, or joining fringe communities like separatist lesbian farming communities, and founding co-ops to share cooking responsibilities amongst a group of families.
God, anytime I have to do chores, I'm telling you, the barrier between me joining a separatist lesbian feminist like commune just so I have less chores to do, oh, it's so thin. It's so tempting.
I know. I'm always like, maybe Nicole could just move out here.
I mean, there's whole fields of studies on this about like the division of domestic labor, specifically like the gender division of domestic labor. It's so fascinating to me because it's also like everyone deals with this. Like this has been a problem for so long, and we're still like, how do we solve this? Or like, surely this shouldn't be so terrible. Chores are bad.
Chores are bad. I feel like I've gotten lucky with my choice of partner in the sense that my husband is super self-sufficient and independent and can do all of his own chores.
Well, let's also be clear, because I would also say the same thing for myself, but like, we would not marry man-children who like need us to do their laundry for them.
Yes, we would not do that. I remember talking to my aunt once, and she's, maybe 60 now. And she was like, well, I have to go home and make dinner for Mark, her husband. And it's just like, you're an independent, like, working lady. You don't have to go feed your man-child husband.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous how this is still a problem for a lot of women.
But like, I look at my grandpa, who's in his 80s, and he really doesn't know how to cook because he's literally never had to. Like, he's always had his wife, or now like my mom to cook for him or feed him. I don't know, it's kind of insane to me.
It really is like a pervasive problem, the cooking problem.
Yeah.
But these feminist restaurant owners wanted the kitchen to be a place for women's empowerment rather than this oppressive domestic sphere. And so feminist food was generally vegetarian, and it represented feminists and environmentalist values of its makers. You know, like other restaurants can do this. They can have like vegetarian and environmentalist, you know, like food. But what makes it feminist is the ideology and the symbolism that surrounds it. A great quote from the book is, "A variety of contradictory food philosophies were still feminist when there was feminist reasoning behind them." Which I really liked, because it's like you could have a feminist restaurant that's like, we're vegetarian, or you could have a feminist restaurant that's like, we're not vegetarian. And they are both still feminists, even though they have different food philosophies because of the ideology of the people who owned and ran them.
It's all also just about like being like conscious. I mean, that's a very classic term from early feminism, is like consciousness raising, you know?
Yes.
Of like you are making decisions intentionally with how you choose to run your restaurant, run your business, all that type of stuff.
And this, like you said, like, you know, this part of the counterculture movement, the 1960s and 70s, vegetarianism was a huge part of that. And it came out of anti-war ideologies that were expanding past just protesting the Vietnam War. And we're also adopting Eastern philosophies. And this counterculture was kind of concerned with like industrial food production and, you know, health. Because, you know, this was also the time of a lot of canned and really processed foods. And so kind of just to summarize, feminist restaurant food was often vegetarian because of the owner's eco-feminist philosophies, the environmental concerns of the times, the needs of the clientele, like the people who wanted to eat this way, and the cost of production, because vegetarian food is a lot cheaper than, you know, meats. Bloodroot's owners, Selma Miriam and Noel Fury, have stated that we don't use meat not only because it's not healthy, but because we equate the oppression of women with that of animals. As women, we do not want to profit from the sale of animal flesh, which I think is a really interesting perspective.
Yeah. I feel like I gotta think about that.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that statement, but I think it's really interesting to see, you know, where they were coming from.
I agree.
And so, because this is a food podcast, I'm going to have you read this little excerpt about what a typical evening meal would look like from former Common Women's Club member Marjorie Childers.
I was wondering if this was like some kind of like, yeah, some kind of like portmanteau between like woman and mom, of like, I'm not just a woman, I'm not just a mom, I'm a womam.
No, I think I just spelled it really, really wrong.
It is the new, this is the new woomph.
Woomph.
Am I a woomph?
Am I a womam?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Marjorie Childers says, a typical evening meal would offer a choice between 2 soups, salad, 3 entree choices, and desserts. Among the most popular soups were butternut squash and cream of potato, and we also made a vegetarian chili. We always had a quiche of some sort, an Italian dish such as eggplant parmigiana, and other pasta or rice-based dishes. We often made Chinese spring rolls, and occasionally we had a fish dish. For dessert, we tried to make honey-sweetened or maple fruit pies and cobblers, but we often fell back on commercial, sugar-sweetened ice cream as a topper. Tea, coffee, and fruit juice were served. For brunch, we had purchased bagels, but we also had eggs and omelets and pancakes made to order. We always had mixed grain bread that we made on an almost daily basis. I think it's so cool that the Chinese spring rolls come back as like a little, I don't think it's intentional, but I do think it's cool that like the whole Chinese restaurants moral panic thing sort of circles back in this.
Comes right back around.
Yep.
And a lot of these restaurants had like a cozy and eclectic home aesthetic, often with like a direct view of the kitchen. They had chalkboards listing the dishes of the day. They had like an open kitchen concept, which minimized the difference between the customer and those working in the establishment and encouraged feelings of familiarity between customer and staff. They were also, commonly one of the few not fat-phobic places of the time.
Nice.
Bloodroot had a sign over the counter that read, "Because all women are victims of fat oppression, and out of respect for women of size, we would appreciate you refraining from agonizing aloud over the calorie count in our food."
Oh, that's cool. I don't know. I mean, I am obviously a very thin person, but women of size is interesting language.
Yeah.
But definitely the spirit is there for sure.
These restaurants also came about because of the 70s and 80s rampant sexism in restaurant business. The women who founded feminist restaurants wanted to separate from male-dominated establishments to escape the oppressive restraints that regulated female socializing and economic activities. So they tried to run counter to capitalism while operating within a capitalist system. And by doing that, they were trying to reconceptualize the meanings of the kitchen for women from domesticity to productivity. And so they created these feminist businesses, which were trying to fulfill a feminist need or advance the feminist cause or improve the quality of feminist life. And they aimed not to be overpriced by market standards and with the highest possible quality, and that the margin of profit should only be high enough to ensure the support of the enterprise, and that these spaces were not to get rich, but to support themselves, live ethically, and support feminist values.
Nice. We love to see that.
And they weren't trying to, gentrify or ostracize the neighborhoods that they were in. A lot of these restaurants really tried to become part of the community and became spaces for community events for socializing, and they played important roles in the community that they were situated in.
That doesn't surprise me at all, since they are, from concept, seem to be very community-minded.
Yeah. And so, another little tidbit on how they tried to kind of subvert the capitalist structure of the restaurant is that a lot of these places did not do tipping for their servers and staff. They paid a above average wage. So I think when I was reading it, it talked about how the minimum wage in California in the 1970s for non-tip positions was $2. And a lot of these restaurants would pay $3. And so it was a full dollar more than the minimum wage at the time, which was a lot.
Yeah. Oh no, that's definitely still significant and really cool.
And they would also have people bust themselves. They would clean up their own tables or go get their own food because they felt that having a waitress was demoralizing and demeaning to the women there, and also encouraged certain clientele to behave differently if they felt that they were of a higher status than the person serving them.
Yeah.
Just to sort of sum up, feminist restaurants obviously were not perfect. They really strived to kind of subvert this capitalist system. But when you're in a capitalist system, you cannot live only on ideals. And so, there was a lot of infighting in these places because they were trying to be community run and people didn't always agree. It was hard to make money in these places because you are trying to pay everyone fairly, and a capitalist system doesn't really allow you to survive if you try and pay everyone fairly. Like I said, these places weren't perfect, they weren't flawless, but even though they weren't necessarily successful in the sense that they don't exist today, they were places for lesbians and gay men and other LGBT people of the time to have a safe spot to go, and an anchor for diverse communities that included all sorts of people that they could be served there and be able to be themselves there, and maybe even also engage in community activities or discover themselves there. So even though maybe they don't exist today, they all had an impact. So just general concluding thoughts on, restaurants as a whole. I think that there's so much out there about restaurants that we didn't even cover in today's episode, like the Michelin rating system.
Yeah, I mean, you really could talk for so long about restaurants. It's such a big topic.
It's a huge topic. And I think today's restaurant trends focus on political and wellness movements, kind of parallel to the feminist restaurant trends, but maybe in a darker way.
Oh, do you mean like greenwashing type stuff?
Yeah, greenwashing, where you could have expensive smoothies or salad bowls or other health foods, but the ideals that they are selling are not necessarily the ideals of the people who are owning or running those restaurants.
And also, like, I always, not always, but I do sometimes tend to wonder with a lot of these, like, say you get a salad from bougie downtown metropolitan restaurant. Like, is that produce necessarily, like, picked ethically? Is the person that, like, picked those tomatoes and lettuce and everything that go into your salad, are they being paid fairly or living in, like, a... Do you know what I mean? How consistent is all of the labor that goes into what goes onto your plate? How consistent is that with like the company's like supposed morals and views?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that one episode of Maintenance Phase. I don't remember exactly what it was about. I think it was like moon dust or whatever it was, where like they are selling this idea of ethically like organic sourced dust or whatever it is, but really it's just like some manufacturer in India and it's being sold as something it's not. And I feel like that's really kind of like the trend of restaurants today, is having like a focus on something that is maybe like considered politically or correct or like wellness or healthy focused, but it's only being used to sort of create capital.
It's like about optics and PR language.
And not the ideologies behind it, like at feminist restaurants. I think also, like, today, France isn't necessarily seen as, like, the be-all, end-all of fine dining. I know I didn't really get into how, like, France is fine dining, or it was, before, like, the 2010s.
Our podcast exists just to put French people on blast, I think. I definitely dissed French people in a previous episode, and here we are at it again.
We can do it again. It's fine.
That should be like our podcast, like subheading, just like Girls Lunch Podcast, dunking on the French since 2023.
Dunking on the French. But like we also have places in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in Dubai that are having a surge in like super high-end restaurants. And like even in the US, there's more of a trend towards chefs focusing on like childhood meals or interracial backgrounds or immigrant families. And also the continuation of trying to locally source products. There's still, you know, the problem of women not being taken seriously in the professional space as a chef.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge problem. Which is nuts if you think about, you know, if you consider like the hundreds of years, or at least the gender stereotype of like, oh, women are the ones who are expected to cook. But like when a woman tries to make a career out of that, or it feels like one of those things that men like sort of like doctoring in a way, where like men sort of took it over and they were like, actually, you don't know anything. You don't know what you're talking about. Because I'm a man who is like a professional career guy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like even today, only 6.04% of 2,000 plus Michelin starred restaurants are led by women. Of the world's best 100 restaurants, only 6.73% have a female head chef. It is like categorically so difficult for a woman to exceed in a professional cooking space, because I think of that separation between domestic and public, and to cross over into like the public restaurant space for a woman is so hard. Like we've all seen Ratatouille.
I was literally just gonna say this. The solution is women chefs need to be like Colette in that scene in Ratatouille where she's like, "You think this is mommy in the kitchen? No."
I mean, if we learned anything from Ratatouille, it's that it's hard to try and break into high-end restauranting as a woman.
Yeah. Or a rat.
Or a rat. Everyone can cook, but can they?
Not my husband.
Right. David can cook. I'm grateful for that.
This podcast exists just to put my husband on blast.
I mean, I put David on blast last time with like criticizing his writing style, so Girls Lunch, putting our husbands and French people on blast since 2023.
Yeah. Should we wrap there?
We can wrap there. We should wrap now before people get mad at us.
Thanks for lunching with us, everybody.
We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Our theme music is Red Onions by Louis Zong. Please check out the rest of his album Vegetable Soul in the description. You can follow us on Twitter at Girls Lunch. Nicole is also on Twitter at NicoleH262. and her website is NicoleHilton.com. Julia is smarter than all of us and not on social media. Thank you for listening. I don't know what the weather's been like over there, but we're getting the remnants of a tropical storm. So it's been like really rainy and blustery and stuff here. So it was like, it's bacon time.
It's gorgeous here. It's been like cold in the morning, but then it hits 68 in the afternoon, and it's just like perfect fall. It's so lovely.
You know what would make it even more perfect? If it got to
Cookies?
69.